Episode 12, Interlude, The Last Bright Night. Interlude, The Last Bright Night. The sun was just beginning to set, and the springtime air was breezy and light. On evenings like these, there wasn't much that made Princess Peach happier than a walk in the gardens. The hedges and flower beds whizzed past as she headed towards her secret spot, giggling all the way. She was by herself, so for now she was free to run and tumble as much as she liked. The adults hated when her skirts got messy, but they weren't here, so Peach took her chances with some special shortcuts. Through this hedgerow, over that stream, and between the ivy trellises, it was a well-practiced route. She knew all the flowers by name, and called out friendly greetings as she passed. There was Heather up on the hill, Iris over by the woodshed, and Lily down by the pond. They never answered back, of course, but Peach liked to imagine that they could. Sometimes, her nannies told her tales about a faraway field where the flowers could really talk, and it sounded like such a paradise. Peach wondered if the tales were true, and if Wisterwood was really as wise as the legends said.
"I'll ask to go there someday and see, just as soon as everyone is happy again."
At 6 years of age, the little princess was starting to notice the world around her in ways that she hadn't before. She knew that people came from outside the castle, and that their stories made her father sad, but nobody ever told Peach what they said. She huffed indignantly at the thought, if the grown-ups wanted to keep their secrets, then fine, she didn't want to hear them anyway. She was a princess, and that meant she was never supposed to be sad. Peach plopped down in the grass with a sigh, trying her honest best to keep herself clean. Her hidden spot was a sunny meadow at the edge of the grounds, out past where the gardeners tended. The grass wasn't kept trimmed here, and the flowers were wild. It was the perfect place to sit, watch the sunset, and gather some daisies. One by one, she plucked up all the flowers within easy reach. Once she had gathered a handful of about 7, she started threading their stems together into a chain. Her little fingers were a blur, she had done this hundreds of times, and practice made perfection. In fact, she decided that this was going to be her best wreath yet. That thought made her pause slightly, her hands slowing as she wondered if her effort would be noticed. A flower's beauty was fleeting, and she always liked to give her wreaths as gifts while they were fresh.
"Mother always loved getting these, but she's gone now."
Peach didn't want to think about that, so she grabbed a few more flowers and shook the memories away. As the chain got longer, the daisies reminded her of another special person in her life.
Would Cousin Daisy have liked a flower crown?"
Peach knew the answer before she even asked. No, Daisy would have hated wearing a thing like this. She was the type who liked kicking at the flowers to make the petals fly, and then betting to see who could grab the most before they hit the ground. Princess Daisy wasn't her cousin, exactly. She was more of a second or third cousin, something removed. Their parents had tried to explain it once, but the two princesses had been too busy playing dragon and damsel to pay any attention. It didn't mean anything to them either way. They were best friends no matter what. After all, they were the only girls of the same age and species that either of them knew. They had been inseparable, once upon a very long time ago. They had meant to grow up together, but one day, suddenly, the visits had stopped happening. The letters had stopped coming soon after, and when Peach asked why, she never got a straight answer from anyone.
"They're very busy in Sarasa Land now, or things have changed outside the castle, or Princess Daisy is."
The next time Peach looked up from her thoughts, the chain was almost finished. It was delicate and perfect, as expected, and Peach tried to keep her smile bright as she threaded the last 2 stems together. She had no sooner finished closing the loop when Toadsworth found her, scurrying over the hill and very plainly out of breath.
"Ah! There you are, princess. You know better than to be out this late,"
the mushroom man chided, scooping the little girl into his arms with a cautious glance toward the sky. Peach gave a petulant roll of her eyes, but let herself be picked up all the same. Toadsworth was her caretaker, and she knew that he meant well, but he was always so stifling. Didn't he know that she was a big girl now, and royalty besides? He carried her back towards the castle, spouting the same old warnings as the sun slowly set behind the walls.
"If we lost you, princess, it would simply be the end of us. You must never wander the grounds without a guardian close by."
Peach wasn't really listening. She was busy trying to balance her daisy crown on Toadsworth's head, but it kept sliding off his smooth mushroom cap. That made Peach giggle in spite of herself. Toads were so silly. By the time they left the gardens, the stars were just beginning to come out. There wasn't a cloud in sight this evening, and Peach watched mesmerized as the tiny lights blinked awake all across the sky. First one, then 10, and then hundreds and thousands as the sun finally faded away. The princess wished she knew their names like she did the flowers, so she could greet them all each night. Every now and then, tight clusters of bright violet stars would zip across the distant horizon. Peach frowned slightly whenever she saw one. They were new, and had never appeared until a few months back. Now they were up there most every night, and were just one more thing the adults would never explain.
"The Star Festival is happening soon, isn't it?"
she absent-mindedly asked, interrupting Toadsworth's safety lecture midstream. It was the end of spring, and that meant the wandering comet would soon be coming home. She would outshine all of these purple pretenders, surely.
"Do you think I'll finally get to leave the castle and see the festivities?"
Toadsworth shifted her in his arms, looking a little uncomfortable.
"Perhaps someday, but this year may still be too soon,"
he said as they made their way inside the castle. Peach wanted to protest, citing all the promises that her father had made, but her caretaker saw it coming and headed her off.
"The king wants to keep you safe, more than anything in the world. I know it isn't easy, but things will get better someday." "How can I believe that, if nobody will even tell me why things are bad?"
The princess huffed to herself, knowing that it would do no good to ask it out loud. She stayed silent from then on, thinking about starlight, family, and all the other wonders of the world that lay beyond her reach. She felt a little better when they entered her bedchamber. A very pink room that was cozy, warm, and totally hers. Hearts and glitter speckled every surface, and every piece of furniture was host to a pile of plush dolls. They all smiled at Peach with their button eyes, reminding her that she still had friends who wanted to cuddle and play. The bedroom was a bit small, sure, but in here, there was no such thing as sadness. Toadsworth set her down, bustling about as he laid out her pajamas and turned down the sheets. As Peach got dressed for bed, she heard him winding up the old music box that she kept in the nightstand drawer. Sometimes Peach had trouble sleeping, but never when her mother's lullaby was playing by her side. In fact, the little princess was already starting to feel tired. Seeing this, Toadsworth lifted her into bed and tucked her in beneath the frilly sheets. He gave her a last gentle pat on the head, and made to leave her behind.
"Good night, princess. May the stars shine down on you,"
he whispered, and soon after he was gone. Peach yawned, torn between snuggling into the blankets and struggling out of them. She wanted to sleep, she really did, but one last thing was nagging at her mind. She hadn't made a wish tonight, and that was very important. She was supposed to talk to the star spirits every night, wasn't she? In the end, the little princess pushed herself up and padded across to the window. Pushing it open as far as she could reach, she looked out over the plaza far below. The castle guards marched back and forth, flickering halos cast around them from the torches they carried. Their little lights paled next to the stars overhead, though, a dazzling dance of nebulas and galaxies spiraling away to infinity. Peach simply stood and watched them for a while, too awed to think about a wish.
"You're drawn to the stars, aren't you? That's interesting,"
a voice suddenly said, making Peach jump and reel backwards in shock. She spun around to check behind her, but her bedroom was still empty. Had one of her dolls suddenly come alive and spoken to her? Perhaps that wooden one with the blue cape? No, that was a silly idea, so Peach shook it off and crept back to the window. It didn't take long to see where the voice had come from. To the left of the window, perched on a nearby gargoyle, was a wizened old Koopa in a hooded cloak. He watched her with quiet curiosity, an enchanted broom hovering in the air behind him.
"Don't be startled, I've only come to ask for your help." "Well, who are you?"
Peach asked instinctively, kneeling down until she could just barely see over the sill. It took her sleepy thoughts a moment to catch up with what the wizard had said.
"And what do you mean you want my help?"
She was only 6, and he was a stranger. What kind of help could she give? The hooded Koopa regarded her coolly, torchlight glinting off his glasses from below. Beneath him, the grinning gargoyle cackled silently at the whole strange situation. Finally the mage broke the silence, every word a measured whisper.
"My name is Kamek, son of the Koopa Kingdom's royal witch. As for why I'm here, I think I know a way that we can stop the war."
"What war?" Peach returned with a whisper of her own, standing up just a little straighter to look the wizard in the eyes.
"I haven't heard about any war, and I'm the princess. I think you're a liar, or a crazy person."
Kamek's eyes went wide as he sputtered in shock. He hopped onto his broom and flew right up to the window, jabbing out a claw to point at a patch of dark sky. As if on cue, several of the violet stars streaked past, traveling in rigid formation across the horizon.
"That war. The war against the invaders from space. The war that's left your very own kingdom in ruins."
He dropped his arm when Peach just stared at him blankly.
"They've been hiding it all from you, haven't they?"
That last bit made Peach think. The grown-ups had been hiding something from her, she knew, but would they really lie to her about a thing like this? She hated the idea of hiding harsh truths behind sweet words or sentimentalities. She was strong, and she could take it. Hadn't she proven that when her mother went away to the Sky Garden? They hadn't lied about that too, had they?
"No. I won't believe any of it,"
she yelled, slamming the window shut and backing away. Whatever the adults were hiding, there's no way it was something as horrible as war. She turned around to jump in bed, but Kamek was somehow in the room already, hovering between her and the safety of her sheets.
"Get out of here! I'm seriously not going to help you. I know this is sudden, but time is short. This will be so much easier if you just—"
She cut him off by hurling a doll at his face, making a break for it as the wizard toppled from his broom. He grabbed at her as she passed, but she was just too agile for him. By the time he had untangled his robes and stood back up, she was already outside in the hallway. But he was in the hallway as well, standing right there behind the door.
How is he?"
She started, but realized that there was no time to think. Somehow, the wizard was moving faster than she could see, and he was starting to look pretty miffed. If running was useless, then there was only one thing left to try.
"Somebody help me, I'm being kidnapped. He's here to steal me away."
She yelled out as loudly as she could, dodging to the side as Kamek lunged for her again. He looked at her pleadingly, but flinched back in horror when frantic footsteps began echoing down the hall. There were guards in every corner of this castle, and they would be here to save her in no time.
Do you have any idea what you've just done?
The mage hissed at her, clutching at her with one claw while he dug through his robes with the other.
This was supposed to be quick and easy. In and out. You were supposed to be back in bed before they ever even noticed you were gone.
Peach grinned triumphantly, happy to have thwarted the kidnapper's plan so easily. Her smile faded when he pulled a wand from his cloak, a golden scepter tipped with a glowing red orb.
I'm sorry, little princess, I didn't want to have to be this messy.
He pointed the wand at her and fired, a flash of white light swallowing her up just as the first guards rounded the corner behind her. The castle twisted away, the world a blur and her senses screaming with the sudden magic of a warp. For half an instant, Peach thought she saw the stars spinning past like snowflakes, but by the next second they had vanished, and so had she. When next she awoke, the princess was lying on a bed of smooth stone. A chilly wind was in her face, and there were excited voices all around. It was enough to tell her that the night so far hadn't been a dream. She opened her eyes to the brilliance of the sky, and sat up to a dizzying view of the world from atop a mountain. Valleys and forests stretched away before her, and here and there the lights of villages could be seen in the far distance. The ground at her feet was a deep sapphire blue, and it glowed softly with the pale luminescence of stardust. The pieces clicked together immediately, and Peach jolted to her feet.
This is Shooting Star Summit,
she realized, remembering the mountain from a day trip that her family had taken here long ago. The princess took a step back, away from the edge, and collided with something warm and scaly that had snuck up on her.
Yo, you're awake!
The scaly thing said, and Peach spun back to face it with a squeal. She was suddenly staring into the red eyes of a Koopa almost twice her size, with budding horns and a shell covered in nubby spikes.
You're kinda cute, and you're royalty, right? The two of us should stick together. What's your name?
Peach asked, playing it safe while trying to figure out if he was a bad guy or not. In truth, he didn't look to be much older than she was, and there was a certain vague familiarity about him.
Do you know why we're here? Did that scary wizard kidnap you too?
The Koopa kid laughed and crossed his arms with a cocky grin.
Nah, not even close. I'm Prince Bowser, and Kamek over there is my loyal minion.
The little mage paused his work in the background to mutter something that sounded like babysitter. Bowser didn't seem to notice, and kept on with his introduction.
We're here to save the world, isn't that awesome? Kamek says that you and me are special, and that we're gonna be heroes.
After a second, he sighed and pointed behind himself with a roll of his eyes.
Oh, and those other losers are here, too.
True enough, there were 5 other kids on the mountaintop, spaced around in varying states of confusion or unease. 2 human boys, also vaguely familiar, were watching the exchange between her and Bowser with marked suspicion. Behind them sat a much pudgier third boy, entranced by a handful of coins that Kamek must be given him to play with. A green Yoshi sat off to the side, barely older than a hatchling, watching the sky with wide-eyed wonder. At the very back, for some reason, was an angry young gorilla in a cage. Glancing around, Peach could see that they were atop the very peak of the mountain, not far from some kind of ancient altar. A great marble slab had been set into the ground, the shapes of 7 stars engraved in a wide circle around the edge. Deep chiseled lines connected the stars to each other, and led inwards to a final star at the center of the ring. It was here that Kamek worked, using his wand to trace strange squiggles up and down the lines, out and then around each of the 7 perimeter stars. The squiggly shapes shone with a golden light as their magic seeped into the stone, and soon the outer stars were shining with distinct colors of their own. Several yellows, 2 blues, and even one inviting shade of pink. Suddenly, and without asking, Bowser grabbed Peach by the wrist and started dragging her over to get a better look. The strength of his tugging hurt her shoulder, and she let out a little yelp as she tried to pull free. In a flash, the two familiar boys stood up, and one was already running over to get involved.
"Hey, let go of her! Can't you see she's getting hurt?"
Bowser rounded on the child with a snarl, grabbing him by the hem of his bright red shirt.
"What's it to you, you snot-nosed little squirt?"
The Koopa Prince shoved Peach back behind himself, so harshly that she nearly tumbled onto her back.
"I saw her first, so she's mine. Go get your own princess." "No way, you're just a bully. You didn't even ask her permission."
The boy shouted, jerking himself free and lashing out to bop Bowser hard on the snout. The Koopa yowled in pain, holding his nose with one claw while he took a feral swipe at his opponent with the other. Meanwhile, the other boy, who was wearing a green shirt, was fidgeting nervously and looking like he hoped to stay out of it all. The two rowdy kids were just about to come fully to blows when Kamek warped in, pushing them both apart with firm waves of barrier magic. The mage glared hard at Bowser, who at least had the decency to look guilty.
"My prince, we talked about this. The 7 of you are all on the same team tonight. You're the oldest, so you're responsible for keeping everyone safe, is that clear?"
Bowser started to give a non-committal shrug, but then his eyes fell on Peach, and after a moment he nodded solemnly. That seemed to be good enough for Kamek, who dropped the barriers and began to usher everyone over towards the altar.
"It's nearly time for the magic show, boys and girls. Let's get you all in your places."
Their places turned out to be the 7 star symbols around the marble slab. The group spent a long while shuffling around, trading spots until Kamek seemed satisfied with their arrangement. In the end, Peach was standing on the pink star, Bowser on one of the blues, and the red and green boys on yellows, alongside the little Yoshi. That just left the gorilla and the pudgy kid. The wizard fretted over them for a long time, before finally throwing his arms up and just sticking them on the last 2 spaces with a sigh. Kamek stood in the very center, surveying his handiwork as midnight began to approach. The glow from beneath lit his face like he was telling a scary story by flashlight, and Peach felt herself shivering against a sudden chill.
"All right kids, here we are. Is there anyone who doesn't know what we're doing here tonight?"
Everyone except Bowser and the ape raised their hands, and the wizard nodded his head like he had expected the outcome.
"That's perfectly fine, I'm happy to explain. It's one of my very favorite things to do, you know."
With a nervous cough, he polished his glasses and started the tale.
"As most of us know,"
he began, casting a pointed glance Peach's way,
"our world is in pretty bad shape. The Shroops have taken over the southern continent, they've razed Sarasa land and the Bean Kingdom to the ground, and now they're heading north into our lands."
He paused to gesture non-specifically around at the sky.
"They've come from up there, somewhere, and there's nothing we can do to fight them."
The wizard pointed down at the altar with his wand, and then whirled it around to indicate each of the 7 kids.
"Star power is the only thing that can save us, and yet the star spirits refuse to help us. Isn't it selfish, that they should hide in the sky while we all suffer down here?"
He chuckled to himself, but there was no joy behind the laughter.
"Here's a fun fact, did you kids know that you're all part star yourselves?" "Wait, what is he saying?"
Peach asked herself, trying to puzzle out how she could possibly be part star.
"Both of my parents are human, though. Well, mother was half-toad, but still."
By the look of it, the other kids were just as confused as she was. Kamek shook his head and tried to clarify.
"I guess that's a pretty difficult way to phrase it. An easier way would be to say that you each have stars inside you."
That made even less sense. How did they get in there? Peach put a worried hand on her stomach as the mage continued.
It's likely that each of you was blessed by one of the 7 star spirits, and so your inner stars reflect their ideals.
Peach looked down at the pink glyph beneath her feet, trying to remember the stories Toadsworth had told her. Miss Star was typically painted as pink, and she was associated with beauty and grace. Maybe Kamek's theory did make a little bit of sense, then? The princess looked around at the other children, wondering which star spirits they all represented. The wizard was already trundling ahead, preventing Peach from pondering the issue.
It's a miracle that I managed to track you all down,
he was saying, his voice tinged with exasperated weariness.
I had to go quite far for some of you. Worlds away, in fact.
He eyed the red and green boys as he said this, but they only glared back with quiet defiance.
I hope your parents know the danger they put us all in, trying to spirit you away to Triple E Earth, or whatever it's called.
Kamek went on to explain the details of his plan. How he was going to create a link between the stars in their bodies and the ones in the sky, and how he was going to use that link to channel wish magic into his own wand. Then, with any luck, he would be able to wish for the Shrub's destruction, ending them once and for all. When he was finished, he walked around the circle and traced a final squiggle on each of the kids' foreheads. Some of them were hesitant to be touched, and the pudgy boy wouldn't stop shouting until Kamek bribed him with another handful of coins. When Peach's turn came, she stayed quiet as the mage drew an upside-down star on her face. As soon as it was done, she felt a strange tingling all over her body, like a magical circuit had just been closed around her. It was past midnight now, and the heavens watched with cold awareness as Kamek took his place atop their altar. The sorcerer raised his wand high, and a pale blue mist began to swirl around the mountaintop. There was no change in the visible sky, but Peach could somehow feel the stars trying to pull away.
They don't want this,
she realized suddenly.
This power is theirs to use, not ours to play with.
But it was too late to quit, and the summit erupted with 7 pillars of brilliant white light. The mist swirled higher, kicking up stardust in its wake, and the princess felt herself being lifted off the ground. The ritual was underway, and the stars were surrendering to its pull. All around, Peach could hear the other children whispering in doubt, wanting to get down, to go home, and to set the heavens free. She could hear Bowser laughing madly, and Kamek was shouting in some odd language that she didn't understand. The light grew brighter, the mist swept higher, and the princess' body was pulled rigid as her inner starlight surged. And suddenly she could see it all. Like someone had pulled back the curtains on a great stage play, and she could see all the strings and secrets of the world. All the stars, and all the wishes they had never chosen to grant. All the people of the land, and a kind of helpless sadness that she had never known. That she was never supposed to know. She could see whole other worlds, and perhaps even other times, as easily as flipping the pages in a storybook. Grand castles crumbling in darkness, and rings of spires as pale as milky glass. Pits of deep shadow, and young girls lost in their thoughts all alone. Flashes of joy and boundless love, moments of pain and endless suffering. 1,000 eyes of all colors blinked back at her in silence. Blue eyes, black eyes, lavender eyes, and weeping eyes tinged a deep, furious red. And then the mountainside exploded, and Peach was torn from her visions as she fell to the ground with a yelp. She pushed herself up, spitting stardust from her mouth, and saw that the other children had fallen too. Kamek was shrieking, cursing and shaking his wand at the uncaring sky. All around them, the ground still trembled from the blast. It was the green-shirted boy who spotted the ships first, warping in over the horizon like a meteor shower lit in violet. They came in every size, from saucers and pods to cruisers and frigates the size of buildings. Peach and the others watched in stunned silence as the fleet moved in, the saucers' hum filling the night as they swarmed around the mountain like bees.
They found us,
Kamek breathed, still rooted to his spot inside the circle.
How did they find us? How did they know that we'd be here?
The ships droned ever closer, and the wizard shook off his daze with a frantic yell.
Get back in your places, kids. We have to wrap this up now.
Peach ran back to her star, but it was too late for the power of wishes. The saucers were firing on the summit, and the stone was tearing itself apart in showers of blue debris. The princess felt the magical circuit close again, and saw her feet leave the ground once more, but this time everything felt wrong. The stars. They weren't yielding anymore. Kamek had stopped chanting, it sounded like he was begging now, instead. Soon he was screaming, jabbing his wand over and over at the sky. It was a useless effort, and everyone but the wizard seemed to know it. A moment later, with a sad sigh, Peach felt her feet touch back to the shaking ground. The saucers were everywhere, zipping around so fast that their purple lights made a web against the backdrop of the night. The larger ships had stopped firing after their initial volley, and now they hovered still and soundless in the air, poised as if waiting for something to happen. Staring into their midst, Peach noticed that the saucer's web had a gap in the middle, a single part of the sky that had remained utterly empty. And then, with a mechanical roar that sounded like the death of space itself, the gap was filled. In from out of the void warped a dreadnought, a single ship so massive that it could swallow the rest with ease. The fleet's violet light seemed to collapse into nothing as it appeared, before exploding outward in a new aura of hateful, bloody red. The ships screamed together, and the invasion truly began. Under the mothership's gaze, the pods and saucers turned inward as one, landing in the forests or embedding themselves within the mountainside. Shapes began spilling out of them, waves of purple and grey, all bearing weapons and clambering upwards toward the peak. The 7 children stood together at the edge and watched them come.
These are the Shroobs. This is the end of the world.
Back at the altar, Kamek was still fiddling with his runes and rituals, possibly trying to improvise some spell that he could use with what little star power he had gained. Peach looked back and forth between him and the climbing horde, unsure of what to do. She felt somebody squeeze her hand, and turned to find the red-shirt boy looking at her with a gentle smile.
I'll protect you, princess, I promise.
By the time the Shroobs crested the peak, the 7 believed that they were ready. They were the Star Children, right? If they had so much magic inside them, then they could totally handle a few measly space shrooms, couldn't they? The aliens rose into view, eyes flashing and fangs bared, hissing to each other in some dry language that sounded like burning leaves.
Look at those ray guns!
The fat boy shouted, indicating the blasters they carried as he hopped around in greedy excitement.
Get me one, you guys! I gotta have a cool ray gun!
Peach didn't think the guns looked so neat once they started firing, blasts of energy tearing their way across the mountaintop. She felt someone shove her aside, tripping to her knees as the lasers passed overhead. Bowser was running ahead, shrugging off the shots as jets of flame spewed from his mouth. The gorilla, still caged, was pounding the bars in panic and trying to break itself free. In truth, they were surrounded. There were Shroobs scaling every side of the mountain, and 1,000 ships hanging in the sky above. The children fought as well as could be expected, dodging the blaster fire and refusing to give up. The boy in red was riding on the little Yoshi, weaving and fluttering between the aliens. Peach watched as the dinosaur gulped up a Shroob and, with great effort, popped out a purple spotted egg. The princess didn't know where to go. She couldn't fight, and escape seemed impossible. She backed up until she stumbled into Kamek, who barely even seemed to notice her.
Save us! Warp us out of here!
She yelled at him, but there was no response. Suddenly, the sound of desperate crying cut through all the noise. Peach turned to see the green-shirted boy, several yards away and surrounded by shrubs. They were closing in, claws outstretched, their sunken eyes dark with hate. The boy was wailing in sheer panic, crying out for help, pleading for his big brother. The other boy heard the call, speeding across the summit as fast as his mount could take him. The Yoshi threw his purple egg and took out a shrub, but another just took its place. It was a mad dash against time, but the two young heroes were so fast. Closer and closer, just a little bit further. But then Kamek twitched up, suddenly alert to the situation at hand. In an instant, he raised his wand and fired it at the boy in red, wrapping him in a magic bubble and blasting him off the Yoshi's back. His eyes were stunned as he floated away, drifting ever further out of reach.
What was that for?
Peach shouted, shaking Kamek by the shoulders as she watched the Yoshi scramble back and forth beneath the bubbled child.
Bring him back down right now. He has to save his little brother.
Kamek shook his head hastily, turning back to watch the younger boy be consumed.
I can't let that happen, Princess. The burst of star energy released when he dies should be just enough power to let me.
The whining shriek that interrupted him was something Peach couldn't begin to describe. The green boy was gone, lost in a sea of tearing claws, but the noise hadn't come from him. The princess doubled over in sudden pain, looking up to see the stars begin to blur. It sounded like the sky itself was screaming. The wizard didn't seem to care. He was firing bolts into the heavens while cackling like mad. He had clearly gained the power he needed for the plan, but it had come with a cost he didn't understand. The night sky was twisting itself apart, a thing in sheer agony, and when it jerked back to normal, some of the stars were gone. All around the battlefield, the other kids were experiencing the same agony. The linking ritual was still in play, an invisible web of starlight and suffering that meant the heavens would share their pain, and vice versa, it seemed. A child had just died, but so had something far greater. Peach staggered to her feet, not wanting to believe that this was real. Drop by drop, it was starting to rain. Peach caught one in her open mouth, and was surprised by how salty it tasted, like saline, or seawater, or...
They're tears,
she realized with quickly mounting dread.
The raindrops taste like tears.
Was this part of Kamek's grand plan, or was it something else entirely? The stars were still shuddering, just waiting for the next blow to fall. They didn't have to wait long. The little Yoshi had kept his eyes on the bubble, and so he had missed the aliens sweeping up behind. They held him down and fired their blasters again and again, and as the lasers flashed the sky screamed anew. Peach was screaming with it, just barely aware of the happenings around her. The gorilla had finally escaped from its cage, and was beating down troops as it made a desperate beeline for the path down the mountain. The princess watched it go and wished it luck, but all hope of escape was gone from her mind. Elsewhere, the fat boy had evidently succeeded in grappling a blaster away from the enemy, because now he was riding atop a confused shrub like a king, firing lasers into the horde and laughing like a maniac.
Ha ha ha! Take that, you puny losers!
He yelled, spinning and blasting any alien that tried to get close.
I'm Wario. I'm gonna win.
Sadly, he didn't win. The boy missed his next shot, and the shrub he had aimed for lunged and tackled him to the ground. Lasers kept erupting upwards as the mob swept over him, but soon the laughter turned to panicked shouts, and then it was all drowned out by the howling of the stars. Nearly half of them were gone now, and whole patches of the firmament had gone as dark as death. The darkness seemed to be bleeding outwards, snuffing out the light in twisting, rippling waves. The sky looked blurred, almost dreamlike, as if it were melting away from within. But the heavens weren't the only thing that seemed to be melting. The rain of tears was swirling itself into a squall, blowing across the mountainside in vast sheets of water and salt. Peach and the others were buffeted by it, but the shrubs were being driven down. To their alien physiology, this was a storm of acid. The saline stained their skin and melted their claws, and slowly, surely, they began to slough apart. High above, the warships didn't seem to be faring much better. In fact, they seemed to be reacting to the storm in the very same way, their hulls beginning to sag and drip as their violet auras flickered. Even the imposing mothership, in all its droning scarlet glory, was floundering. Pieces buckled and fell away, and the shrubs on board tumbled out into freefall, only to shrivel up and vanish in the rain. Peach watched it happen in awe, but she was torn back to the present by the sound of an explosion. Somewhere below, a melting saucer had fired a single shot into the mountainside, causing fresh tremors as the stars above writhed to pieces in their pain.
They shot the gorilla,
she realized as she fought to stand against the madness. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed her by the wrist, and the princess looked up to find Prince Bowser beside her with determination in his eyes.
"Don't just stand there, we have to get out of here."
He nodded toward the path, now so tantalizingly empty of enemies.
"Kamek is useless, so forget him. This is our one chance to escape."
Peach ran with the Koopa in a half-daze, letting him lead her across the summit. She glanced back to see the shrubs scrambling after them, tripping in puddles and struggling to aim their lasers as their limbs dripped away. Eventually they fell behind, and the prince and princess started down the pathway together. The way was narrow, and the dusty ground had become slick with rain. All around her, Peach could hear the dying rasps of her pursuers. She wanted to feel something for them, even a wretched pity, but she didn't think she could do that anymore. This was a war, and all that mattered was surviving the night. They hadn't gone far when the echo of distraught shouting made her turn back again. Back up the trail, the way they had come, the boy in red was following at a wild sprint. His bubble spell must have worn off at some point, and now he was leaping over rocks and shrubs alike as he tore a path down to freedom. To her. Here at the end, he was still trying to reach her, to save her. She saw the laser blast tear up through his chest from below. She saw the light leave his eyes, and watched him fall backward into the alien stampede. Time slowed to a crawl, and she felt the stars collapse in torment as the greatest of their number went out. Bowser was yanking her by the arm, and soon the chase was back on. There was no time to grieve for a friend that might have been. The children tripped over fallen stars and slid across slippery stones as the path wound ever downward. All around them, saucers plummeted from the sky like molten meteors, impacting the mountain with splattering explosions. Suddenly, a new kind of noise eclipsed even the wailing of the stars. Peach looked around for the source, and found that it was coming from high above, from the mothership. The flying fortress was shuddering in the air, its aura failing alongside its engines. The noise wasn't that of decaying machinery, however. It was a guttural sound, filled with living rage. There was something forcing its way out through the melting dreadnought's tip, twisting the metal into an obscene snarl as it emerged. The shape was a black silhouette, eldritch and bulbous, and it seemed to unfurl and expand as it dragged itself into the storm. Thrashing hyphae wrapped around the ship like tentacles, mangling it further as they tried to keep a grip. To Peach, the sight was almost hypnotic. For one fleeting moment, their eyes met across the abyss. Baby blue against hellfire crimson. But then a smaller shape fell limply from the hole in the ship, and the abomination turned away as it hurried to catch the thing. Peach watched it cradle the new figure gingerly, almost soothingly, until it must have melted away in the rain. The great beast, whatever it was, shut its burning eyes and turned to the heavens with a grieving roar. The sound of it pierced planet and sky, echoing throughout the kingdom until even the dying stars fell silent. It lasted until the monster's grip failed, the hyphae slipping free as the thing plummeted off the ship towards certain doom. The princess wanted to watch it fall, but Bowser was jerking her back to reality.
What are you staring at? We're not even halfway down the mountain yet, we have to keep moving.
The cruisers were starting to fall now, and their explosions were big enough to shake the entire countryside. At this rate, Shooting Star Summit itself would be lucky to last the night. A shot rang out, and Peach felt the sizzling of plasma as the laser blast barely missed her. She turned back to see a cluster of shrubs huddled beneath an overhang, backs against the rock, while they took pot shots at the escapees. There were more emerging from a crevice nearby, turtled beneath salvaged metal plates that were slowly dissolving in from the edges. Peach yelled to get Bowser's attention as another shot whizzed past, narrowly missing the both of them. The Koopa Prince skidded to a halt as he turned back with a snarl, choosing to fight rather than flee. In one fluid motion, he released the prince's wrist, spun to face backwards up the hill, and let loose with a foe-devouring torrent of flame. But in the suddenness of the moment, Peach hadn't had time to pull her arm away. She let out a strangled cry for help, but it was too late. Bowser's fire tore through her, consuming her arm like kindling. She felt the skin searing away, felt the bones crack beneath the heat. She felt her fingers, so delicate and dainty, char and wither to slag. It all hurt so badly that she nearly blacked out, everything forgotten as she tripped back towards the ledge. Bowser caught her at the edge of the precipice, terror in his eyes as he realized what he had done. The shrubs were forgotten as he fretted over her ruined body, trying to put out the fire that had spread to her clothes.
That was bad. Listen, are you okay? Hey. Keep your eyes open, princess. Stay with me.
Through cloudy eyes, Peach saw the aliens dragging something out from their little crevice. It must have been a gun from one of the ships, because it looked too big to be any kind of handheld blaster. It was a menacing sight to behold. A cannon with no barrel to speak of, only a pair of glowing mounted rails, thrumming almost visibly with some kind of magnetic force. She tried to warn Bowser, to make him turn around and see, but no sound escaped her lips. The pain was so great that she couldn't even make herself scream. The prince wasn't paying attention anyway. He thought the threat was roasted and gone.
You can still run, right? I mean, your legs aren't burned at all.
He was shaking her by the shoulders now, desperate and enraged.
Get up already. I'll take you back to my castle and...
Why wouldn't he just turn around? Why couldn't he take his eyes off her for 1 second and understand? It was no use, she could only stare past him as the shrubs assembled their weapon, and then heaved it out into the storm in one last suicidal blitz. She heard the mechanisms charge, watched the dying enemies pivot and take aim. The first shot took Bowser in the shoulder, tearing off the very arm he had been holding her up with. He erupted in a roar of blind fury, sputtering embers as the pain brought him to his knees. The howling only lasted a few seconds, until a second blast took off half his face. For one pitiful instant, the Koopa seemed to pull himself upright, like a marionette trying to stand with cut strings, but then gravity took hold, and he toppled forward over the ledge. Peach fell with him, pinned beneath the dead weight as his body sagged against her. The world vanished in the wind as they plunged down the mountainside, and the princess knew that she'd be crushed if she couldn't escape the corpse before the impact came. She twisted aside with the very last of her strength, landing on her back as Bowser kept on tumbling down the slope like some forgotten boulder. The force of it knocked the wind out of her, and she felt the snapping of bone as her legs buckled against the rock. Slowly, she slid down the hillside until she came to rest in a puddle of tears. There she lay, burned and broken as the last of the spacecraft crashed down around her. It hurt too much to move, so instead she just kept still and watched the fading of the sky. In the far distance, she could still see the glow of the mothership, somehow still fighting in spite of it all. She watched as the dreadnought finally lost its long battle, vanishing under the horizon as it crashed down somewhere in the valley below. Peach's vision was starting to flicker, but she barely even noticed as the darkness crept across her eyes. The blackness in the sky was far scarier than whatever was happening to her. Everything was just gone. She didn't know what it all meant, but she could feel the emptiness in the very pit of her soul. Soon, the storm faded away into mist and memory, and the mountain was left in silence again. The battle was over, and so was the war, but could a night like this ever be called a victory? The princess hopelessly scanned the cosmos one last time, gasping despite the pain when she finally saw it. There, far overhead and a little way to the east, was a single struggling star. It was a pale little thing, no brighter than a firefly seen from all the way across a meadow. Peach guessed that this tiny star was tied to her. After what she had seen, it only made sense. This twinkling thing was hers to save. An odd thought struck her then. In all the fuss, she had never made her nightly wish. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had been back in her bedroom, listening to her mother's lullaby as she stargazed out the window. She knew now that wishes meant nothing at all. But still, what else did she have, here at the end? This last star, this one wish, was all she had left to give. Slowly, she closed her eyes and whispered to it in her thoughts.
I wish that you were strong enough to stay.
The tiny light flickered, doubted, but held on.
Please live, no matter what. Please stay with us.
With a shallow sigh, Peach turned away. She couldn't bear to see what happened, and it all hurt so much. It was the kind of pain she knew would never go away, no matter how hard she tried. She lay there with her face in the puddle, no longer moving, the salty water mixing with fresh tears of her own. It hurt all the way to the last. Kamek dashed into the house, slamming the door behind him and collapsing against the frame in relief. He had made it back again, and nobody had spotted him yet. How many days had he been playing this game? 2 days, maybe 3? It was hard to tell anymore, what with the sky being, well, totally destroyed. The stars were one thing, but the sun and moon had vanished as well. That first non-daybreak had been a shocker for pretty much everyone, that's for sure. The Mushroom Kingdom was in an uproar. Not news, but this time it was even worse than usual. Their princess had been kidnapped, the stars had screamed their way into oblivion, and the land was littered with half-melted space debris. There were theories, of course. There were always theories. Some of the toads were calling it an inside job, and there were heated arguments about which chemicals could or couldn't melt such and such types of metal. A few folks were even spreading the bedtime story that the star spirits had sacrificed themselves for the world.
As if they had even cared.
Nobody except Kamek knew the real truth, and he intended to keep it that way. If word got out that he had caused all this, then they'd turn him into turtle soup before the next non-sundown. He especially couldn't go back to the Koopa Kingdom. His mother was far too shrewd, and she had probably put the realm on high alert as soon as the prince had gone missing. Prince Bowser. He was gone. That thought made the wizard pause, if only for a moment. The prince had possessed a bratty streak, sure, but he was also strong and brave, and he could have even been honorable with the right training. He would have made an excellent king someday, and Kamek had never intended for this to happen. The Magikupa pushed himself to his feet, suddenly feeling decades older than he really was. He would mourn the prince in due time, but for now he needed to focus his efforts on the living. The mage gathered up his little basket of forages and set off through the stolen home. This was a house at the base of Shooting Star Summit, a cozy old place made of mortar and stone, with a tiled roof painted bright purple. Kamek had found it on the night of the event, empty of occupants but filled with their things. Whoever had lived here, they must have fled the scene when the spaceships began to fall. The thing was, the house wasn't just filled with the humdrum furniture of some peasant family, it was packed to the brim with magical artifacts. Crystal balls, vanishing chests, talking mirrors and the like, the whole mystic menagerie. There was even a cabinet upstairs filled with star pieces, something which would no doubt become a scarcity in the coming days. Kamek had a pretty good image of the owners. He had heard through the grapevine that a pair of shamans lived on this mountain, so this was probably the place. The shamans were a mage clan who could trace their lineage back to a pair of tribes that had once squabbled over the whole multiverse. Needless to say, they were insufferable to hang out with, and were part of the reason why Kamek had stopped going to magic conventions. Even so, there was no denying that they knew their craft well. Thanks to them, the wizard had been kept well occupied during his stay here. There was a modest library downstairs stocked with all manner of rare magical tomes. Beginner's guides to divination, dusty grimoires on dimensional magic, and strange prognostici written in languages he couldn't hope to understand. Some of the books didn't even have titles, which is how you know it's the good stuff.
"I'll have to borrow some of these when I leave,"
the mage grinned to himself as he passed by the shelves.
"Who knows, I might learn something pretty neat."
He was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of shattering glass in an upstairs room, and then the shrieking of a banshee. Kamek winced at the noise and hurried up to face the music. The little princess was awake, and she must not have been in a very good mood. He had found her on the mountainside after everything was said and done, torn to pieces and barely breathing. She was the only one left of the 7, and he had brought her inside as a gesture of pity. He hated to guess what had happened to her up there. Had she tried to escape? What madness had possessed her to try a thing like that? The girl's right arm had been the worst of it, putrid and charred down to the bone. The mage had never been very good at healing spells, but he had spent an hour or two making an effort all the same. It hadn't done much good, but truth be told, he hadn't tried very hard. So what if the girl had a few burn scars on one limb?
"Better her than me, am I right?"
She had been scared when she first woke up, crying for her servants and begging to go home. At some point she must have cried herself out, because then she got angry. She had spent the past day up there screaming bloody murder, and eventually Kamek had gone out foraging just to get away from the noise. Taking a moment to gather his strength, he entered her bedroom to see what was the matter this time. He immediately spied the source of the shattering glass. It was a vase of daisies that he had conjured to sit on her bedside table, now laying in shards against the opposite wall. He had thought that the flowers might keep her calm, but apparently not. The princess herself was sitting in bed, exactly where he had left her, staring at him with a sort of hunted suspicion in her eyes.
What do you want from me? Why are you keeping me here, you?"
She trailed off as she caught a glimpse of his basket, her gaze snapping up to meet his own.
"What are those?" "Wild mushrooms from the mountainside,"
he offered, holding up the basket of fungi. They had sprouted up in abundance after the storm had passed, so he had been gathering them up for her to eat.
This is the second batch I've brought you, do you really not remember?
She watched him for a moment in disbelief, saying nothing, before sagging back against the pillows and turning away. When she finally spoke again, her words were hesitant and unsure, her tone distant.
You lured us up there to die.
She turned back, slowly, to stare at him with hate.
You led us into slaughter, and I'm the only one left.
Kamek had to interject, because that simply wasn't true. In fact, he had told her as much once before, back at the castle.
I never intended for any of the star children to get hurt. You were all supposed to be home by now, safe and sound. That things happened this way is an unfortunate mistake, and...
But the little girl wasn't even listening, she was too consumed by her own grief-stricken fantasies for that.
I'm the only one you chose to spare.
She savagely pulled the blanket down, exposing her ruined arm to view.
And now I am this.
With that, she utterly broke down, heaving against the mattress as if trying to sob.
What have you done to me?
She asked, barely above a whisper. Then suddenly a madness overtook her, and she was lunging across the bed with bloodshot eyes.
What have you done to me?
She collapsed at the edge, the burst of strength failing her as suddenly as it had come. Kamek caught her before she hit the floor, hoisting her back up and moving to sit beside her. Unsure of what to do, the wizard gave her an awkward pat on the shoulder, watching as she shook with the motions of tears that would not come.
It'll be okay, princess. I'm here.
He wasn't sure what had made him say it, but it was still true. The wizard was free to leave at any time, to let the girl die, and yet here he sat, unable to bear the thought. Perhaps it was all in the way Prince Bowser had looked at her that night, or maybe he was simply scared of a life without purpose. Either way, he wanted to make her a promise.
I'll fix all of this, I swear. No matter how long it takes, someday I'll set us both free.
She was silent for a long time, staring at the floorboards as 1,000 possibilities played out within her eyes. In the end, she smiled and looked up at him from behind a sugary sweet mask.
Take me home, then, back to the castle. Fair payment will come in time, but you must never leave my side again.
Kamek nodded and squeezed her unburnt hand, not realizing the bargain that he had just struck. They left the very next morning, leaving the mountain and all its sorrow behind them. Wherever life's path led them from here, they would face its hardships together. The worst of it all was surely in the past, wasn't it? It wasn't, of course. Neither of them knew the depths of this nightmare they had made, or the ways in which the future would shape them. Someday, a night would come when they'd realize the truth, lost in their own storm as the end of the world came again. But that's a tale for another time. End of chapter.